Michael was 14 when his father moved him and his new stepmother to Pontiac, Michigan in 1928. His father had been a skilled machinist in their old community in Menifee County, Kentucky. His mind was able to figure out what was wrong with motors and set it straight. It became clear that he had the ability to do more than just be a farmer. So rather than following the rest of the family who migrated to Ohio to work at the Armco Steel Factory, he went to Detroit, Michigan. It wasn't long before his father secured a job and climbed up the ladder at General Motors, working at Pontiac Assembly on Baldwin Avenue. Once he was able to purchase a house, he brought the family back together again. The house was humble compared to what they saw built in Detroit, but for them it was a dream home. It was next to a small lake to the west of Pontiac, Michigan, with a dense woodland around it. 10 acres of it was their own. His father planned to board during the week in town and be home on the weekends. At the time, Michael thought it was an odd living situation, but looking back, he understood why his dad bought the place. It was in their price range, and it gave his father a forested retreat from the bustle of the industrial city. As for Michael, he loved it. He had his own room for the first time with walls rather than curtains separating it from other rooms, and it wasn't nearly as drafty as their old Kentucky home. During the work week, while his father was in town, Michael was the man of the house, and he spent most of his time outdoors doing chores and getting to know the fish in the lake. On this particular day, he was fishing along the shore in the shade of a large tree. It was close to sunset and darkness was starting to close in on the woods. Michael started getting a nervous feeling, but he brushed it aside after looking around to make sure nobody was sneaking up on him. After another unsuccessful fishing trip, he packed up to head in before complete darkness set in. His father said that most predators had been killed in Michigan, but the thought that he might run into the last cougar or wolf pack was enough to keep him from trying to stay out all night. As he started walking, he heard a rustling and saw movement out of the corner of his eye in the bushes. He turned to get a better look, and he got a glimpse of the creature before it ran off. He could only see the top of its head, about 5 or 6 feet above the ground. The rest of its body was hidden. Michael was pretty certain it was a bear, but he couldn't explain why the creature's head remained so high as it turned and ran away. It would have to be an immense bear or one that was comfortably running standing up. Common sense said that he should return to the house, but his curiosity made him walk in the direction the creature had run. Behind the bush, Michael found a small game trail, and he followed it deeper into the woods until he came upon a small clearing. On the far end of the clearing was a rustic teepee-style shelter, made with wood and branches. Next to it was a deer carcass slung over a low tree branch and a pile of bones 2 feet high. He could hear heavy breathing nearby, but he couldn't locate the source of the sound, and considering the disturbing condition of this camp, he wasn't going to go look, and he turned and ran back home. Several months passed, and Michael made sure to avoid that direction of the forest where he had come across the primitive camp. He had heard strange noises coming from that area over the fall and winter, but his father and stepmother dismissed it as wild dogs or the winter wind. When spring finally came to the woods, it had been quiet for a month, so Michael decided to go back to the camp. He knew it probably wasn't wise, but he was curious about what he had seen. He was hoping that whatever had built the camp had moved on. The next morning, Michael finished his chores and then grabbed his fishing gear and his pocket knife and started walking in the direction of his old fishing spot. The trail was easy to find, even though he had avoided this area since his previous encounter. When he reached the bush, he noticed the game trail and his trail were equally worn, and the game trail appeared wider than before. He reached in his pocket and fingered his knife, a small wave of fear rushing over him. Michael waited at the bush for several minutes, listening and observing his surroundings before starting to walk down the game trail. Every sense was on high alert as he reached the edge of the clearing, but the only sounds around him were birds. The teepee and bone pile were still there, but the camp appeared empty. Slowly, he walked towards the teepee and was a few feet away when he heard a loud crack come from the woods to his left in the clearing. The noise startled Michael so bad he took a sideways step, tripped, and crashed into the bone pile, knocking most of it to the ground. As Michael was laying on the ground trying to compose himself, a loud growl came from behind the teepee. He tried to stand up, stumbling and tripping on the bones around him as he rose, his eyes firmly fixed in the direction of the teepee. As soon as he had his feet under him, he ran as fast as he could across the clearing and onto the game trail. He could hear something large running behind him, but he didn't dare look. He reached the trail back to his home and he kept running all the way home, only stopping once he was safely inside. That night, Michael had a hard time sleeping. The moon was bright and created long shadows reaching through his window all night. Every time he would start to nod off, he would hear a noise outside of his window that would startle him awake. The moon was high in the sky when something blocked all the light from coming in his window. He could faintly make out a face in the window, but he was too terrified to scream. Suddenly, he heard a blood-curdling scream, and the wall of the house rattled as if being hit by a battering ram. Then the face was gone. Moonlight streamed back through his window, but there was fog on it where the face had been. His stepmother came running into his room, and he explained what he saw. He spent the night in her room waiting for daylight. When they woke up, they went outside to investigate and were unnerved by seeing confirmation that last night's horror had happened. Massive footprints could be found in the softer spots around the house, and there was a crack in one of the bedroom window panes. Their gardening tools were strewn about the yard, as was the woodpile. It was several days until Michael's father came home for the weekend. When they explained what happened, his father went with him into the clearing and destroyed the teepee. They didn't hear any more vocalizations or have any more attacks on their house. But Michael never went fishing in that area again. He knew the night attack was revenge for messing up the bone pile, and he was afraid that if he was caught alone in the woods, he would be part of that bone pile. They didn't live much longer in their little woodland house. The stock market crashed that October, and his father lost his job. Even with all of his talent, there were hundreds of other talented men out there competing for the same jobs. Job prospects were bleak, and with no relief in sight, they lost their house. Michael's family packed up what they had and headed out west to California, eventually settling outside of Fresno. Even though the forest was close enough to visit his entire life, he never spent another night in the woods. His children and grandchildren would ask to hear his stories about living in the woods of Michigan, but thought he was pulling their leg. That all changed when stories of tall, ape-like creatures inhabiting the forests of California started spreading like wildfire. Thanks for listening to Squatchable Campfire Stories. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and click on the bell to get alerts when we post new videos or when we start up a live stream. You can also join the conversation below, or you can find a link to our Facebook page in the video description and join us there.